Hannibal Lecter, a brilliant psychiatrist, refined gentleman, and most infamously a cannibalistic serial killer. He was first introduced in Thomas Harris's 1981 novel Red Dragon, and then became a cultural phenomenon after Anthony Hopkins' unforgettable portrayal in The Silence of the Lambs. Despite his monstrous acts, he's terrifying not because of brute force, but because of his sheer intellect and composure. He's the type of killer who quotes Dante while peeling your face off, and makes it feel disturbingly elegant. What makes Lecter unique among serial killers is his duality. On one hand, he's cultured, sophisticated, and deeply intelligent. He enjoys classical music, fine art, opera, and gourmet cuisine. On the other hand, he commits brutal murders, often eating his victims or serving them as dishes. He kills with style, often targeting those he sees as rude, corrupt, or deserving, and his relationship with the FBI trainee Clarice Starling in The Silence of the Lambs is one of the most iconic psychological dynamics in fiction. Rather than attacking her, he engages in a tense, cerebral cat-and-mouse game, offering her clues to catch another killer, Buffalo Bill, in exchange for pieces of her traumatic past. And Hannibal was partially inspired by a real-life doctor in Mexico who was both a respected physician and a convicted murderer, and Anthony Hopkins won an Oscar for Best Actor with just 16 minutes of screen time in The Silence of the Lambs, one of the shortest performances ever to win. And in the books, Hannibal has a photographic memory, speaks several languages fluently, and has an IQ well above genius level. And the character has appeared in 5 films, a TV series, Hannibal starring Mads Mikkelsen, and 4 novels. Michael Myers is the embodiment of pure, unstoppable evil. First appearing in John Carpenter's 1978 horror classic Halloween, Michael begins his killing spree as a 6-year-old boy who murders his older sister for seemingly no reason, and after spending 15 years in a psychiatric institution, completely silent the entire time, he escapes and returns to his hometown of Haddonfield to begin a new killing spree on Halloween night. Unlike other slashers who taunt or talk, Michael says nothing. He doesn't run, he doesn't show emotion, he just walks slowly, constantly, and inevitably toward his victims with a butcher knife in hand and that blank, white mask on his face. The terrifying part is there's so little we understand about him. He's not driven by trauma, revenge, or even hatred. He just kills. In fact, Dr. Loomis, his psychiatrist, famously says, "I realized what was living behind that boy's eyes was purely and simply evil." Michael is often referred to as the Shape, not just for his imposing silhouette, but because he's meant to represent evil in its most primal, unknowable form. Whether it's stalking babysitters, wiping out entire houses of teenagers, or even surviving seemingly deadly injuries, Michael doesn't stop. He doesn't feel pain, he doesn't plead, he just exists and kills. Over the decades, Michael Myers has appeared in multiple sequels, reboots, and timelines, each adding layers and sometimes confusion to his mythology. In some versions, he's cursed by a druid cult. Yep, that happened. And in others, he's simply a relentless killer with an unexplainable drive. But through it all, his core concept remains the same. He's a faceless force of death, a walking nightmare that no one can reason with or escape from. And his iconic white mask is actually a Captain Kirk mask, spray painted white with the eye holes cut wider. He has killed over 100 people across the franchise, making him one of the deadliest slashers in horror history. And Michael never speaks in any of the films, not a single word. And another fun fact, John Carpenter wrote the original score, that eerie piano theme, in just one day. Johan Liebert isn't just a serial killer, he's a philosophical abyss in human form. Introduced in Naoki Urasawa's masterpiece Monster, Johan is a young man with a beautiful face, polite manners, and the soul of a void. As a child, he was the subject of horrific psychological experiments, and while his sister Twinina seemed to repress the trauma, Johan became something else entirely. A cold, calculating manipulator, capable of destroying lives with a whisper. His first known murder was a child, and from there, he spiraled into orchestrating a trail of death so vast it includes serial killings, mass suicides, and psychological collapses, all without ever leaving his fingerprints. He doesn't kill out of anger, revenge, or desire. He kills to explore the concept of identity, to witness the collapse of human will, and to prove that life is ultimately meaningless. He convinces people to murder others, to kill themselves, or to question their own sanity, sometimes with just a conversation. He's the kind of monster who smiles gently at you while nudging you toward the edge of your own destruction. And his ultimate goal? To walk into the abyss so completely that no one even remembers he existed. A living ghost who proves that the most horrifying thing isn't death, but emptiness. And what makes his story even more impactful is that Johan doesn't exist in a supernatural world. There's no magic, no monsters, just him and the damage of a truly broken, brilliant human being can inflict. And his foil, Dr. Kinzo Chenmo, represents the opposite, a man who believes every life is sacred, and their conflict becomes less about survival and more about existential meaning. Johan has been called the next Hannibal Lecter in Japanese media because of his calm, calculated demeanor and psychological manipulation. He often uses aliases, but never commits murders with his own hands, unless absolutely necessary. He prefers to inspire others to do it for him, and despite being responsible for dozens of deaths, Johan is rarely seen committing violence on screen, as most of his horrors comes from what he makes others do. And his character was heavily inspired by real-world psychological studies on identity loss, especially those involving war orphans and child soldiers. Patrick Bateman, the central figure in Bret Easton Ellis's American Psycho. He is a wealthy, handsome 26-year-old Wall Street investment banker living in 1980 Flair. His victims range from homeless people and sex workers to friends, co-workers and even strangers who have better business cards than he does, or pop music. In one scene, he gives a full analysis of a Huey Lewis and the News album while hacking someone to death with an axe. And this twisted blend of consumerism, narcissism and unchecked violence makes him a symbol of soulless capitalism. A major theme in American Psycho is ambiguity. By the end of the novel and the film, it's unclear how much of Bateman's violence actually happened and how much exists in his head. Is Bateman himself. Christian Bale's performance in the film was based on watching Tom Cruise on a talk show, whom Bale described as having intense friendliness with nothing behind the eyes. Dexter Morgan, a forensic blood spatter analyst for the Miami Metro Police Department by day and a serial killer by night. But not just any killer. Dexter only targets other murderers. Taught by his adoptive father Harry to channel his homicidal urges into something useful, Dexter follows a strict set of rules known as the Code of Harry. Only kill those who are guilty beyond a doubt, never get caught, and never harm the innocent. On the surface, Dexter is calm, charming and socially functional, but inside, he describes himself as having a dark passenger, a violent force that compels him to kill. The terrifying part? He knows he's a monster, but he's trying to be a monster with morals. And what makes Dexter fascinating and unique in the world of serial killers is the way he grapples with identity and emotion. He starts off feeling nothing but the need to kill, but over time, he forms real relationships with his sister Deborah, his girlfriend and later wife Rita, and even his son Harrison. And these connections slowly blur the lines between the mask and the man beneath it. Dexter often questions whether he's truly a psychopath or if he's capable of changing. But every time he tries to live a normal life, the darkness inevitably resurfaces, often with deadly consequences. Throughout the series, Dexter is constantly haunted by fate, guilt, and the very justice system he works for. His greatest fear isn't death, it's being exposed. And the tension comes from watching him balance a double life, manipulate those around him, and try to stay one step ahead of discovery. Yet, as viewers, we root for him because he's killing bad guys, even though we know he's one himself. And that moral tightrope is what made Dexter such a groundbreaking character in the anti-hero era of television. Dexter first appeared in Jeff Lindsay's 2004 novel Darkly Dreaming Dexter, which inspired the Showtime series, and Michael C. Hall, who played Dexter, also played a mortician in 6 Feet Under, another death-heavy role that made him perfect for Dexter's quiet intensity. And despite being a killer, Dexter has a massive fanbase, and many viewers consider him one of the most likable murderers in fiction. So some of you might disagree that he's on the list, but hey, it's my list. Jigsaw, the main antagonist of the Saw franchise. He's a former civil engineer who, after being diagnosed with terminal cancer and surviving a suicide attempt, develops a rap philosophy about life and death. His belief: people don't appreciate life until they're on the brink of losing it. So he begins abducting individuals he deems ungrateful, immoral, or wasteful, and puts them through horrifying, elaborate games or traps that test their will to survive. If they complete the challenge, usually involving extreme pain or sacrifice, they live. If they fail or give up, they die. Jigsaw sees himself not as a murderer, but as a teacher, giving people a choice. That twisted moral justification is what makes him especially terrifying. And despite being terminally ill and dying in the third film, Jigsaw's legacy carries on through disciples like Amanda Young and Detective Hoffman, and his influence spreads like a virus, his traps becoming more brutal, more complex, and more symbolic. But John Kramer himself was never chaotic. He was calculated, thoughtful, and philosophical, often quoting lines like, "Those who don't appreciate life do not deserve life." And his voice, usually delivered via creepy puppet Billy, became iconic, along with the chilling line, "I want to play a game." And what sets him apart from other horror villains is that his traps are often metaphorical reflections of his victims' sins. And there's a poetic, albeit demented, justice in his games. He forces people to confront the worst parts of themselves, often often in grotesque ways. And though he abides by a moral code, that code is completely twisted, a justification for sadistic, deadly puzzles that leave viewers questioning whether he's a vigilante or just another control-obsessed monster. John was originally meant to be a small part of the first Saw film, but his popularity turned him into the franchise's centerpiece, and he's one of the few horror villains who dies early, but remains active in the story through tapes, flashbacks, and protégés. Light Yagami is the main character in the anime Death Note, who begins as an exceptional high school student, brilliant, handsome, and bored. That's how it always starts. His life takes a dark turn when he discovers the Death Note, a notebook dropped by the Shinigami Ryuk. The rules are simple. Write someone's name in the book while picturing their face, and they die. At first, Light uses the notebook with what he sees as noble intent. He begins eliminating criminals around the world to cleanse society and create a new utopian world where he reigns as a god. He adopts the alias Kira and becomes a global mystery and fear-inducing force. But what starts as a crusade for justice quickly erupts into obsession, narcissism, and murder. As Kira, he sees himself as the ultimate judge, jury, and executioner. Anyone who threatens to expose him, even innocent people, becomes fair game. Over time, his methods evolve. He manipulates, deceives, and sacrifices anyone, including his own family and allies, to protect his identity. And what makes Light so terrifying is how convincing he is. He believes wholeheartedly that his actions are righteous, even as the body count spirals into the thousands. His most legendary battle is against the Detective L, a mysterious, eccentric genius who becomes obsessed with uncovering Kira's true identity, and their psychological duel becomes the heart of the series. Two intellectual titans trying to outwit each other in a high-stakes game of life and death. Light hides behind the layers of false innocence, using charisma and manipulation to control those around him. But his fatal flaw is always his pride, and his belief that he's untouchable, that he's smarter than everyone else. And in the end, that hubris is what brings him down. But still, Light's IQ is considered one of the highest in anime, often compared to characters like Lelouch from Code Geass or Johan from Monster. And his favorite food is potato chips. And yes, that infamous "I'll take a potato chip and eat it" scene is legendary for a reason. And his creator, Tsugumi Oba, designed Light to be perfectly moral at first, so his descent into madness would feel more tragic. John Doe, the antagonist in David Fincher's masterpiece Seven. He is a deeply disturbed yet terrifyingly articulate killer who commits a series of murders based on the 7 deadly sins: gluttony, greed, sloth, lust, pride, envy, and wrath. He remains unseen for most of the film, yet his crime speaks for him, each one a grotesque, symbolic punishment meant to reflect the sin of the victim. And his victims aren't randomly chosen. They're selected and judged according to his strict, delusional moral code. And John Doe isn't messy or impulsive. Every murder is planned with surgical precision, often taking weeks or months to execute. He believes he's doing God's work, showing the world just how sinful and broken it has become. When he finally turns himself in, covered in blood of his latest victim, it isn't out of guilt or fear, it's because he's executing the final stage of his master plan. By the film's end, he draws Detective Mills, played by Brad Pitt, into the final act of his twisted sermon, forcing him into a moral and emotional corner that explodes in one of the most iconic endings in the history of cinema. And John Doe doesn't kill out of enjoyment or rage, he kills to send a message. In his mind, he's not a monster, he's a martyr, a prophet. He's disgusted by the apathy and filth of the modern world, and sees his crimes as both punishment and art. It's this psychological intensity and twisted sense of purpose that elevate him beyond typical horror villains and place him in the realm of Hannibal Lecter or Jigsaw, a killer who weaponizes ideology as much as brutality. And he was played by Kevin Spacey, who intentionally had his name removed from all marketing and opening credits to preserve the shock of his sudden appearance. And John Doe has only about 15 minutes of screen time, but completely dominates the film's final act. His kill for sloth is one of the most terrifying in film history, taking place over a full year of psychological and physical torture. And the screenplay originally had a less bleak ending, but Fincher fought to keep the iconic box twist, saying it was the only honest ending for a story that dark.